Sheryl WuDunn, where's the name come from?
Oh, well, that's, I found that when I went to China on my first visit. I remember, I'm a third-generation Chinese American and grew up in New York City and had no interest in going to the countryside. But Nicholas Kristof actually encouraged me to go. And I remember driving down that path. We were driving through the scattered rice paddies. It was a land away from what I had grown up in. And we got to this small little village at the edge of a little lake, and there I was standing in the village, and I must have been 2 feet taller than almost everybody else there. And the women there were all gray-haired, and the children were tiny, tiny little kids. And I thought, this is the village where my father's father was from. And I didn't think that I had any relatives there. I was sure I hadn't. I had nothing in common with these people. And as I talked and talked and I told them who my grandfather was, they said, yes, yes, I am your distant cousin, a woman said as she sort of stepped forward. And I was shocked. She had a different last name, of course. In Cantonese, her last name was, I'm going to pronounce it, it's going to sound awkward, And it was from there that I found the story of how my name had become WuDunn. What had happened was that my grandfather had bought some papers, which was common in those days, to go overseas to the U.S. And the papers had the same last name, because in Cantonese, my name, the first part of my name is and he got to Ellis Island, and he said, well, my name is Dan Suk. Now that just really means like Uncle Sam. And they didn't hear the they had no idea what it was. They didn't know what to do with it. So they just heard the Dunn. They said, oh, your name is Dunn. So my grandfather for the longest time was William Dunn. And finally, after getting all these phone calls, people calling up and saying, are you Dunn? And then hang up, he decided, well, he's going to take the Mandarin pronunciation of his name and call it WuDunn. So that's how I'm a WuDunn.
Now, you found out something about your grandfather you didn't particularly care for.
Yes, I did. It was rather shocking. While I was there, I discovered that he had had another wife, a wife before my grandmother, and that, in fact, they had both gone to the U.S., the first wife and my grandfather, and she bore him 2 daughters, but no son. And so they went back to China, and on that trip, he decided to leave her there. She wasn't going to be able to bear him any more sons, he thought, and so he took another wife and brought her back to the U.S. and had 3 children, including my father. So it was a very rude awakening to discover that he had essentially abandoned his first wife. He never saw her again, and she stayed there until she died in the 1960s.
When did you leave China permanently?
1993, at the end of 1993.
And this book that you've written, did you spend time doing only that?
Yes, we did. We spent a few months while we were still in China, working just on the book. I mean, the book is a culmination of our 5 years there. We heard hundreds of stories from all the people we met, and we've had many, many different experiences. And we wanted China to come alive to Americans. We wanted to tell the stories of the many different Chinese that we met.
The minister that you danced with.
Yes. That was interesting. In fact, Nick and I had a very good partnership, because there were times when the Chinese wanted to meet a foreigner, and they call him a big-nosed foreigner, big-nosed American. For instance, when he went to Beijing University and he would do interviews, students knew that he wasn't a spy. But me, they weren't always so sure. But there were other times when they didn't want to speak to a foreigner. They didn't want to get caught with a foreigner, and so I could slip into their homes and learn their secrets. I remember one time I was researching the topic of sexual harassment and the status of women, and I found myself at a dinner dance party, and a cabinet minister asked me to dance. He apparently thought that I was a local secretary or something, and as soon as we got out onto the dance floor, he tried to force himself upon me. I was shocked, but it gave me tremendous insight into the status of women, into how women are treated and how cabinet ministers look upon them as perks. Certainly a non-Chinese wouldn't have been able to have that kind of experience.
What kind of an accent do you have?
It's very interesting. The nice thing about China is that it's such a vast country that full of so many different dialects that if you're in the North, people will say, oh, you have a Southern accent. If you're in the South, people say, oh, you have a Western accent. It was very, very useful.
I gather that you've been to all 30 provinces. How about you?
Oh, not as many, but what, 18, 19, I don't remember.
How often did you travel together?
Never.
Almost never.
Never?
Never.
How come?
One time we did travel to the seaside resort of Beijing, and that was because I found a political story to write about, and he found a travel story to write about him, but that was about it.
Xiao Pang is, who is he?
You want to know what his only formal title is? He is the honorary chairman of the Bridge Association. Cards. So it really shouldn't matter what happens to the honorary chairman of the Bridge Association, right?
You call him an emperor.
He is, okay, of course. He is the emperor of China, and an emperor in China rules until he dies. So essentially, when Deng dies, that I think it will have far-reaching change for China. We may not see it immediately. For instance, if he dies Monday, we may not see anything on Thursday. In the same way that Brezhnev's death laid the groundwork for some remarkable change in the Soviet Union, it wasn't immediate, but we saw what happened, evolved later on.
How old is he in this picture that we just saw?
That is in 1990, so he was 86. He's 90 this year.
You went to his hometown?
I went to his hometown. It was a very interesting trip. He has never been back. He left when he was about 16 years old and never turned back.
Never been to his parents' grave?
Never been to his parents' grave, which is very unusual in China because there's a certain holiday, a certain part of the year where they specifically go to the graves of their ancestors and sweep the graves.
What does that say about him?
What I think it says is that his relationship with his family, which was basically a middle-class family, the local landlords, it was a very tenuous one. He, I think, was partly embarrassed by the fact that he came from a nice, fairly wealthy background. And here he was, a revolutionary, a communist. And it must have been very difficult for him to reconcile that. And he probably was very, very busy.
How did you get to the New York Times after you'd been at the Wall Street Journal?
Oh, I got married. Basically, I had had internships throughout the country, and then I went to Hong Kong, but I got married, and then Nick was sent to Beijing, and I started stringing for the New York Times, and then just strung my way onto the Times.
When you went back to your home, where your ancestors were from, what did you see? I mean, talk about it in terms of what we have in our lives here in this country.
I see. Well, the village that I saw in my father's village is very, very backward. Even though it's in the southern part of China, I was just devastated at how poor the huts were. They were made out of brick and stones put together, and sometimes they were painted yellow or gray. And
we have a map here, and we're going to show that you have at the front of the book. And I want you to show me, if you can, where your home is on this map.
Okay, well, it's in right here. That dot.
So
it says Taishan.
And how did you get there?
We took Nick was with me, we took a van. Well, of course, we got to Guandong. We got first to Macau. From Macau, we took a taxi, and we drove through the winding dirt paths in Guandong province and got to the county Taishan, and then got to my village. I mean, a lot of times they were barefoot, or they had sandals that were ripped up and had been probably 10 years old, and their clothes were shabby. And I mean, I wore my sort of worst clothes. I just wore the rags that I could find, and I still felt as though I had just walked out of Bloomingdale's. It was very sad to see that, because I had had so much. Here I had grown up in the States. I was educated at private schools. I took French, and I shopped at Macy's and Saks. And here was my distant cousin, who was 60 years old, because in China, of course, the generations, they have kids at a younger age. And there he was. He couldn't even write his name. When I asked him for his address and his name, he had to ask someone else to write it down for him.
Where did you go to school here in the States?
I went to a school called Fieldston High School in New York City.
And then where?
And then I went to Cornell University.
Got a degree in what?
Intellectual history.
And your parents are still in New York City?
They are still in New York City.
What did they do, or what do they do for a living?
Oh, they're in business. They have their private businesses.
And why did they come here in the first place?
They were actually born, well, my father was born in the States and my mother was born in Canada. But my grandfather came over because at that time, everybody looked at the U.S. as the golden land. Everybody wanted to leave China. And that's the sad thing, because back then, this was in the 1920s, people were leaving China because they thought there was no opportunity there. And that's still going on. Even in China today, even though China now is just a remarkable country going through an enormous economic revolution, people still look at America as the land of opportunity.
Carpeting on the floor, cars in the village, stoves in the house, refrigerators.
None of that.
None of that.
None of that. When I went there in 1987, there was none of that. There were no refrigerators. They cooked on a very, very primitive, I think they had their own coal, which they would cook on, but it was very primitive. And, I mean, sometimes the stones or the bricks would fall out, would have rotted away, and they had no money to repair it. They had chickens, they had pig living right in their front yard. I mean, it's not really a yard, it's just in front of the house. That was in 1987. It's very different now. China has just, the economic strides are remarkable. I went back there in 1993 as well.
Back to your home?
I went back there to see
what had changed.
Well, one family there was having a celebration because the grandchild in the family was 1 month old. That's a tradition in China. And so there was a big banquet going on, and everybody from villages in the area were coming, and they were sitting down to an 8-course meal.
Eating what?
Eating all sorts of things. They were eating meat, also chicken, they were eating pork, they were eating all sorts of vegetables and mushrooms.
Would they have done that in 87?
With 1 month celebration, they would have celebrated it, but not nearly as much as I mean, maybe they would have had their few greens or vegetables, because they are farmers, basically, and so they do produce their own food. So they will have a lot of vegetables and rice and not much meat at that time, but they would have had some meat.
You wanted your son to be delivered in Hong Kong. How come?
I had visited a number of hospitals in Beijing just to check this out. I was also writing a story about the issue, and so I thought I would take an opportunity to look at the maternity wards. And it was perfectly fine. I'm sure that I would have had no problem, but I just thought, what if? What if I needed sort of immediate surgery or something like that? I just didn't want to have surgery in China.
How come?
Because I just didn't like there was a risk that I didn't want to take. And it was my first child. I had not been through this experience before. I was a jittery, expectant mother. I thought Hong Kong was the better way to go. And I had a lot of other reporters had done the same thing. They'd gone down to Hong Kong. And so there was a tradition of people based in Beijing going down to Hong Kong to have their babies. We have every reason to be down on China. When we were there, when we just got there, kids were killed on Tiananmen Square. My husband was shot at. My son was effectively banned. We have friends who were thrown in prison, and they're still there. But despite all that, we think that the most important thing going on in China today is this economic revolution, and it's probably the most important thing going on in the world today.
What did you see change from 87 to 93?
Oh, I remember when we first went in 87 and we were interviewing rich peasants. These are officially chosen rich peasants. Of course, they would want us to see the best. They were making the average or equivalent of $100 US, $200 US a month. Now, in 1993, Nick actually met someone who, as a furniture business, he's a peasant as well, and he has got a 10-story building that overlooks the rice paddies, and his assets are worth $40 million US. And I know someone who went into the real estate business, and in 2 years has accumulated an empire worth $100 million.
At the end of your book, you write about the last dinner. Would you tell us that story?
Oh, yes. After 5 years, well, for us, 5 years, but every correspondent, before they leave, they have a dinner with the foreign ministry in which they basically receive a nice plaque of the Great Wall and shake hands and smile a lot and take a very buoyant message about China back to the U.S. So we had our meal at the same time. There was our handler, Mr. Zhao, and another woman who he brought with him. And we were sitting at the table, and we were all smiles and talking about very light conversation. And he all of a sudden brings up the fact that, Mr. Kristof, you went to Xinjiang province without approval. Well, this is where we got scolded for Nick's having gone on a tourist trip and writing about it. And then he proceeded...
Are you speaking Chinese at this time?
Oh, yes. Yeah, we were speaking in Chinese. And then he started berating us for how we have damaged Sino-U.S. relations, and it was all... I mean, I just stopped eating the shrimps. I just didn't feel like eating anything. And the poor woman was embarrassed. She just looked down, straight down at her table, refused to look at either of us or even Mr. Zhao, and just, you know, just kept eating as though nothing was going on. She just clearly had tuned out. And he just kept going on, and we were just horrified. And we thought, well, let's just smile and, you know, swallow our food and switch to English, because we thought that maybe if we started speaking in English, he would feel a little bit awkward and wouldn't be able to criticize us so much. We did that a little bit, and then the dinner was over and we just sort of ran away, and it was really a mistake on their part. I mean, the Chinese government always seems to put its worst foot forward. They have an impeccably awful sense of public relations. Here was an opportunity to leave us with a nice picture of China, and yet they ruin it by, they spoil the dinner and, you know, leave a bitter taste in our mouth.
Would you have been a communist?
No. No, I didn't really have any kind of affinity for that.
What about the family when you were growing up?
Oh, my parents were, in fact, my grandfather on my mother's side was on the welcoming party when, for Sun Yat-sen, the other side, the Taiwan side, so they were not communists.
I wrote down the name Ah Chang. Mm-hmm. Who was he?
He was a man who, he's a Cantonese.
What does that mean?
And that means that he is from the southern province of Guangdong, and he lives in what used to be called Canton, but now everybody refers to as Guangzhou. And
let me stop you. If you live in Guandong?
Guangdong province.
Guandong province.
Guangdong province.
Is how close to Hong Kong?
Oh, that's very close to, it borders on Hong Kong, and that's where my home village is.
So if people go to Hong Kong, they can get in a train or in a car and drive right up there?
Right.
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
Right. And he's a very interesting case because every time I met him, he would be richer, he would be more he would have all these new business ideas. He was a man who was not very pro-democratic. He really cared mostly about coming up, making money, and helping his sisters, helping his family along. But around the time of the Tiananmen Square massacre, after the massacre, he saw his opportunity. He saw that now, if he could just claim himself a student or someone who had supported the movement and get overseas and claim asylum in the U.S., then he wouldn't have to go back to China. So he bought a passport, fake passport, and that got him to the U.S.
What did it cost him?
$40,000 US. He had that much money then. But when he got there, he turned himself in. And he turned himself in because he couldn't live with, he was afraid that he would be caught with a fake passport, even though he had gotten as far as he had.
Where did he go?
He went through, not directly to the U.S., he went through Asia, spent some time in Singapore and Japan, and then back to the U.S.
And he turned himself into?
He turned himself into the authorities, to the U.S. authorities. And he thought that they would be sympathetic to his cause. He said that I was I sympathized with the students and I helped them, and, you know, I'm afraid that I'll be persecuted if I go back to China. They didn't pay any attention to him. They sent him on the first. They sent him back to China, and he was fined a lot when he got back to China, and he had nothing with him. He had lost all the money that he had invested in this venture, and he had to start from scratch. Luckily, he was not thrown in prison, because we know other people who have been thrown into prison. But he started from scratch, built up another restaurant business, and he was really lucky. He found a great spot, and so one day, foreign investors came up to him and said, "We want this spot, and we'll pay you another $40,000. We'll pay you $40,000 for the spot." He took it. Now he's running all sorts of businesses. Now he's going into the pharmaceutical business. He's smuggling dogs into China, which in China it's rather unusual because Chinese are used to eating dog, not having them as pets. He's smuggling them into China as pets. And he says, you know, I'm doing something good for China. I'm trying to tell Chinese people that dogs are nice things as pets, not as food. One of the things that we were most proud of, the stories that we were most proud of, was about the family planning clampdown that took place. It began in 1991, and it led to the forced sterilization of millions of women. Basically, there's a one-child policy in China. People are allowed only one and sometimes two, and depending upon the area, remote, if it's very remote, 3 children. But because Chinese families, especially in the countryside, they favor boys over girls. And so if they only are allowed 1 or 2 kids, they want it to be a boy. Lineage is passed down through males, and daughters marry outside of the family, so they want boys. So the result is that every year, 1.7 million baby girls go missing. Some of them are unreported. Some of them are, the midwife takes the head of the newborn baby and dunks it into a bucket of water. A lot are aborted, done in even before they are born, because of the new machine that is probably the most remarkable in China, having the most pervasive influence, and that's the ultrasound machine. Expectant mothers go to the doctors, and they're not supposed to learn the sex of the fetus, but if they pay a bribe to the doctor will tell them. And if it's a girl, they usually abort it. And then after they've had maybe 1 or 2 kids, the woman is forced to go through a sterilization. So we learned about this. We wrote about this, and we were very proud of it. We learned about it 2 years after the clampdown had begun. The foreign community learned about it 2 years after it had begun. And no policy, probably in the world, affected so many people so intimately as this family planning clampdown.
Chapter 10. I'll show this picture because you have it in your book. You start off this with an excerpt, or rather, how would you describe it?
Startling one.
Startling excerpt from a book. Why?
Because that just shows how far China has come. People still have this image of the Chinese as prudish people who don't like to talk about anything that touches on sex. But of course, you know, the population is growing enormously, so it does exist in China. And it exists in the literature now. This one book that was written by an author who actually has a fairly good reputation for writing good fiction. He wrote this book called Wasted Capital, and it's about the decadence. It's about the lewd lives of several individuals. And he just describes, for instance, a woman dies masturbating with corn cobs. I mean, it's just, some of the images are just outrageous. And it did very well in China. In the last few weeks and months that we were there, it was a hot seller, and the authorities tried to ban it several times. Finally, they did ban it, but there were still a lot of copies that had already gotten out.
Here's your dedication. Who is what's the name on the bottom?
She's my sister.
And is she the one that's in Hong Kong?
No.
Obviously not, because she died in 1983.
She was on the KAL flight, the KAL 007, unfortunately.
Where was she going?
She was going to Hong Kong.
And how old was she at the time?
She was 21.
You did reference, though, in the book that you have a sister in Hong Kong. How many children in the family? 4. How does someone get a satellite dish?
Oh, well, you can go to a store and buy it. Then they enforced this, they tried to enforce this new regulation where you couldn't buy satellite dishes, but you could still get them.
You quote Alex de Tocqueville, you bring up James Madison in this book, and you talk about the civil society. What's the point?
The point is that China right now, although it doesn't have Jeffersonian democracy, there is a movement there, there is progress. Nick talked about cannibalism. There is no longer that kind of cannibalism there. But people are getting a larger stake in the system. We have people now who are interested in listening to talk radio. I mean, talk radio is something from the West. It's through talk radio, people are discussing problems of romance. They're talking about the garbage collection, the filthy garbage that's all over the street. Why doesn't someone clean up? They're complaining delicately about officials. about their local officials, people who have done them wrong. There's a new law, administrative law, that allows people to sue government bureaucracies. Tiny, tiny little changes, but they are steps toward a more freer, a more richer society.
When do you report in Japan?
Oh, the end of the year.
How do you think you'll be received in Japan versus how you've been received in the United States over, you know, being a Chinese, Asian
Oh,
parents?
I think it will be very interesting. The status of women in Japan, of course, is even worse than it is in China. And in China, it's still pretty bad. I mean, you know, in China for thousands of years, women have been thought of as nothing more than walking wombs. And even my grandmother, she had her feet bound and always walked very awkwardly. And you would have thought that after 10 years of reform, 15 years of reform in China, that the status of women would have risen dramatically. But in many ways it hasn't. You know, you have the rise of the market, and with the rise of the market comes sinister industries like, for instance, you have a trade in copper, you have a trade in toys and clothes, but you also have a trade in women. You have the trade in wives. Businessmen and women, they go to villages in the countryside and they recruit these uneducated peasant women with the promise of better jobs and higher pay, and they transport them to other areas, remote areas of the country, where they don't know the local dialect. And in China, if you don't speak the local dialect, you basically cannot communicate. And they sell them to uncouth peasants, and I know of one story where a woman, she tried to escape, and the peasant blinded her. He gouged out her eyes. I mean, that kind of stuff goes on in China.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.